Thank you so much for inviting me. Renata, Francisco, todos que están involucrados en esta invitación, Mariel. Estoy de veras muy... sorry, I have to speak in English. Sometimes I didn't notice I'm speaking in English or in Spanish. Sorry. Perhaps I will switch into other languages, but you understand all Spanish more or less, eh? More or less. Next one I will speak in Spanish. Okay, but now I prepared it in English, so I will speak in English. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really very glad to be here and to share with you some ideas I'm thinking about since some years. The question is, why area studies, wo muss ich draufdrücken? I have to, here, no? Here? Sorry. No, hier es gibt sowas Schickes, ja, hier. Here. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, alles klar. Okay, so the question is, why area studies matter for understanding Europe and modern liberal societies? Normally the question is, we need area studies to understand the others. But I will explain, I hope I can do it. We need area studies. We need to think about other contexts to understand Europe. And I will make it clear, and I hope that could be perhaps some of the arguments help you to defend and to develop your center. I will try to answer the question by showing from various points of view that Europe, like we know it is Western Europe, would not exist without Latin America. But before doing this, let me mention what the contributions of area studies are in a very global sense. Area studies teach us to think in terms of interdependencies, to change perspectives, and to reconstruct contexts. Sure, part of this is to understand the others, to translate, to be in between different languages, different cultures. So we need to know some languages to do this kind of research, and we have to think about translations all the time because we are translating all the time. So that is more or less the meta idea. But I would like to show that area studies can open up the narrow concept of progress and liberty, core elements of the liberal script of modern Western democracy. Ideas that present the liberal script in singular as articulations of great philosophers, as ideas and norms of the Western world, often fall short. Ideas, norms, and practices are constantly being negotiated and renegotiated, contested, continued, questions, rejected by social actors in different historical and social contexts. We can discover variation through comparative processes, but variation of what? Of a grand narrative of liberalism, like in England, like in the States, like in France? Are ideas, norms, and practices not themselves interdependent and resonant relations that need to be reconstructed first in order to gain an understanding of diversity of multiple liberal scripts, in plural? The ensembles of variation should not be understood as existing side by side. That loves a political scientist loves to have the different societies side by to make to distinguish. But it's not this thinking side by side, it's thinking in interweaving the liberal script. There is an interaction that constantly bring together very different actors with very different ideas of liberal narratives and their critique. Instead of a linear expansion, these variations are better understood as developing through complex processes of expanding and writing and rewriting that can also entail the dismantling of established norms and practices. My presentation focused on the dependencies and relationship between resonances between Latin America and Western Europe society. With regard to the liberal scripts, this meant focusing on processes on actors in Latin America and the Caribbean who are involved in the formation of liberal narratives. In a historical sociological analysis, I'd ask a double question. How much Latin America is involved in the success story of the liberal scripts? And in which relationship of resonance and defensiveness is the region involved in the ensemble of the liberal script globally? The way in which they are intervened are diverse and have undergone multiple transformations over time. One constant aimed this, and this is inequalities between the region, inequalities between Latin America and Europe. In Latin America, and you all know this, structural dependencies on European have emerged, which Latin America dependency theory identified in the 60s and 70s, and which have been described in colonial and post-colonial theories since the 90s, the last century, as new power relation, as colonialidad del poder. However, the inequality between the regions, Latin America and Europe, is also articulated in the fact that the European part largely ignores its own influences and dependencies arising from the interdependence with Latin America. Latin American authors such Fernando Coronel emphasize that Europe-oriented and Eurocentric views limit Latin America solely to serving as a place of enormous raw material wealth and cheap labor. European ignore that Europe itself has undergone over a long period of time in this process a changement. Aníbal Quijano speaks of the simultaneous and reciprocal emerge of America, he meant Latin America, and Europe. So there is an interaction in the emerging, in the creation of these two regions. So it's not only Latin America that is dependent on mutual interdependencies. Europe also arises and exists in these interdependencies with Latin America. So without, that's our hypothesis, without Latin America, Europe would not have been able to assume the global supremacy, and large regions in Europe would have remained without development opportunities. I will make this clear. With two ideas of the liberal script. The first is progress, and the second is liberty. Is freedom. So the first step, global interdependencies and the foundation of Europe's progress. The violent conquest, this is my friendship to the Andine region now. The violent conquest of the Americas not only led to a geographical expansion of spheres of influence of European colonial powers, but the Columbian exchange also meant a change in the European and American way of cultivation, nutrition, and lifestyle, which was driven by the exchange of animals and plants. At the beginning of the colonial period, Europe had neither the resources, money and goods, to purchase luxury products from the elite from Asia, nor was domestic agriculture production sufficient to feed large parts of the population. This changed with the interaction with Latin America. And the first example are potatoes. And potatoes, I like potatoes, not culturally, because they are a symbol for shared interdependencies beyond market relation. Staple food, such corn, tomatoes, peppers, from the colonies became indispensable for European dishes. However, the potato from the Andine proved to be essential for survival. The now popular tuber was unknown in Europe until the colonial period. as was the extent of also of the very extent and very sophisticated pre-colonial research and knowledge of the Incan knowledge production about this corn. The nutrition of potato in various European regions was not only changed people's diet, but also the production of knowledge. That is very important because with the potato, in the introduction of the potato in Europe begins the production of knowledge in agriculture and began something like the science of agriculture. Before this, the peasants did what they want to do. But now you see here the array of Prussian, Friedrich II, discussing with the peasants how to cultivate potatoes. So the introduction of potatoes civilization in Europe managed to improve the living conditions of millions of people and advance at the same time scientific research and our understanding of agriculture. However, and this is very important, this has not negative effect in the Andine region. There was no influence in the Andine region about their kind of production of potatoes. They do it like always until nowadays. So it's one of the very specific products that was not globally commodified. And so the potato is really an example of a shared global fruit, corn. And we can say, and I say to my dear friend, the potato can be seen as a generous gift from the Andine world and as an example of how shared global interdependencies are possible without one part having to enrich itself at the expense of the other. But there was really an interdependency without dependency. The second example, sugarcane, is very different to this. Because the introduction of sugarcane from Asia illustrated the complex and interweaving of inequalities relation. Its cultivation led to fundamentally different production and social relation via the transatlantic slave trade. Plantation production based on slavery is linked to the commodification not only of products, of sugar, but also of people, of human beings. Sugarcane and also cotton quickly linked agriculture based on enslaved Africans in the colonies of the Americans into the Caribbean, Brazil, and the south of the United States, linked them to the development of industrialization and consumption in Europe. My last example, not my last, but one of the very important also, is silver, because silver is a commodity and at the same time is world money. And these two possibilities make it possible that the Europeans change the position in the world. And because the mining production in Potosi, Bolivia, and in the north of New Spain, today Mexico, with a lot of environmental problems and with a lot of forced labor and so on. But for the Europeans and for the elite in these colonies, this silver was a key to the riches of Asia. Because before, the Europeans had nothing to offer to the Asian commerce. They really had a problem of structural trade deficit. And so the silver, it changed a lot. With silver, there was possible a new kind of interrelation, and majority of silver went to China because the Europeans wanted to have these nice products, cotton and silver and so on. And they also made a mistake. The Chinese, they changed their currency to silver, and so the dependency was here. But this is very important that the silver opened a new global interrelation to Asia and made Mexico in the center, in the heart of the New World. Okay, we have this kind of expansion of commodity. That is the silver in China, the silver made in Bolivia or in Mexico, produced by the Spanish colonizers, and then they made in China. The expansion of commodity frontier in Latin America is going on. The last, or one of the last examples we are working about this, and others is soybeans. And the soybeans are really very interesting also, because it's not only the European and the Latin American relation, or the North American and European and the Latin American relation. It's also China as a new actor in this kind of relations of commodities that entered in the last 20 years. And so we have really a worldwide domination of nature and externalization of the costs, not only from Europeans and North Americans, but also from part of China to Latin America. And Latin America, sure you know it, because you have the classes from Renata. Latin America is the world's leading region for the production and export of agriculture and mineral resources. The subcontinent is particularly affected by these shifts of borders. And soy is not the last one we can mention. It's all have to do with the new ecological sustainability and the green economy and so on. That's part of this is going on the fields and on the territories of Latin America. But it also have to do with knowledge production. It's not only the industry and the farmers and so on. It's also we, the scientists. We also need this kind of laboratory, because you know in Europe it's very complicated to make agriculture with genetically modified transgenic soybeans and others. And so, for example, Brazil is offering not only the land, but also the research infrastructure to collaborate in this kind of research and externalization. It goes together this externalization of the risks of this kind of research. Okay. What all commodities have in common is a profound change to ecosystem in terms of time and space. So we are externalizing our costs to other regions and to other generations. Second step. Cultural resonance. Rich freedom for whom? In a second step, I would like to show the relationship of resonance and defensiveness in which liberal scripts are created in Latin America, or in which they are further developed and written and rewritten in critical debates. The interaction are exemplified by two cases. The first case is the revolution in Haiti and the liberation of the enslaved people. The second is the liberal reform. And in this sense, Haiti is a progressive expansion of a liberal narrative. The second, the liberal reforms in Mexico and in other parts of Latin America, the second reform in the 19th century is a narrowing of the idea of liberal scope, because it's focused only on property rights and not on property and not on other kinds of rights. But first, example, Haiti, freedom from slavery, independence from the colonial power. The majority of the philosophers' reflections in Europe, in which freedom is discussed as a natural human conditions and abstractly proclaimed as a fundamental human right, either completely ignore the enslavement of people in Africa, and you can show it, or they don't mention it. They accept it in some points. And so we have this paradox that others discussed it, that Hegel know a lot of Haiti, and in his philosophy you can see a lot of relation between Knecht and Herrschaft, yeah? But it's not mentioned, but he knows about Haiti, but it's not mentioned. And it's interesting to reconstruct his production of knowledge and his interrelation of knowledge about Revolution Haiti. But it is another topic I can't mention now. In the following, I focus on the resonances in which the idea of freedom is articulated in a colonial slave society. In all founding documents of liberal narratives, freedom is of central importance and is associated with happiness, property, and security, and as well as the right to resist to oppression, for example. This is also the case in the French Declaration, Les droits de l'homme et des citoyens, which is not only important for the French Revolution, but also for the Haitian Revolution. The first article says, man is born free and equal in rights and remains so. The abstract text does not name any specific person or instances. However, it does in fact address a specific section of population without naming men. In the prevailing conditions, such concretization is not necessary. All people know about they are discussing, including women, enslaved and colonized people, is beyond their ideas, their realm of the sayable, of the thinkable. For majority of the participants of the French Revolution, it's not thinkable on Negroes and on women. However, it is precisely in the abstract version of the Declaration that can be read as a meta-text from a concrete context. And this shows the lawyer and linguist Cornelia Fissmann. Perhaps you know her. She was in Frankfurt and in the Max Planck Institute of History. And she did a very interesting analysis of the French Declaration, and I will use it for analyzing some ideas of the liberal script. In her linguistic analysis, Cornelia Fissmann demonstrates that the double structure of the Declaration on the one has a double structure. On the one hand, as a legal text with the rights and duties of the French male citizens, French. The word homme in the French Declaration is interpreted as man, is read as man. On the other hand, the same text describes absolute rights, whose existing depends not only on the existence of being human in the sense of human beings, not as man and woman. Understood as absolute rights, the Declaration forms a meta-text that has been written down against oblivion, as the preamble states. As a meta-text, the Declaration also can be appropriated by previously excluded and future speakers. You know from Latin America that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a lot of social movements spoke and speak about human rights in this sense, for meta-text. So precisely because the subject man is not positively defined in the Declaration, anyone can take the place of homme in the text and use and rewrite it in another reading. The text can be reappropriated from others. By articulating their specific ideas of freedom, equality, and self-determination in different historical and cultural contexts, people claim the Declaration as an instance of speaking. As early as 1791, various actors took the floor and rewrote the Declaration in order to be able to inscribe themselves. In Paris, Olympe de Gauche, in the Déclaration des droits de la femme et de la citoyenne, replaced homme, man, with femme, women, and demanded equal rights for women in the public sphere but also in the private sphere. In their declaration, there are parts about marriage. So she is rewriting the text, not only writing, but rewriting. In this way, Homme became visible as male and could be articulated abstractly as human being, making the inclusiveness of women visible. In the same year, the enslaved people in Santo Domingo rose up and fight for the abolition of slavery. They demanded nothing less than personal freedom from enslavement. More than 30 years before the Slavery Abolition Act, which declared all slaves in British colonial empire free in 1834, and just 2 years after the French Revolution, mulattoes, blacks, free people, slaves were fighting for freedom and equality in French colony Santo Domingo. In the course of the French Revolution and in the context of the Anglo-Saxon abolition efforts, information was circulating in this moment. But the most important impetus for the people in Haiti came from the revolutionary practices, not from the discourse. That was explained, but the practices of the French Revolution. And in one of the papers you can read, the first report of storming the Bastille was interpreted by the slaves very clearly. And the policeman, the chief of the police wrote it clear. The slaves are anonymous that the white slaves had killed their masters and have come into possession of all goods of the earth. So they interpreted the practice in their context and have become into, and the radical change between 1791 and 1884 were interwoven with very complex processes and it was extremely complicated to understand these processes at the time, but finally ended with under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture with the independence of Haiti. The first independent state in Latin America was only slowly perceived by contemporaries as they couldn't understand it, and for them it was the intervention of the English or of the Spanish that could be the people that are doing this. There is some international intervention. But the women in Paris and the enslaved people in Santo Domingo did not simply adopt the demand for freedom and equality. By expressing concrete experiences of injustice, both inscriptions gain a concreteness and a radicality that goes far beyond the abstract text and makes new variation of liberal scripts thinkable. The Haitian Revolution concept of freedom is not a simple variation of the liberal script. The slave uprising led to a break with colonial relation. And this colonial relation was based on a symbolic order of the world. And this symbolic order made the people different. In doing their revolution, their liberation from slavery, they question the symbolic order of the Western world, of the colonial world in this moment, that has established different degrees of humanity. At the beginning of the 16th century, and we know it until today, in which the white man was given leadership and the indigenous people in the New World were seen as children who could learn something from Christian faith. But the Africans, they are not humans, and they are not part of the Catholic cosmos. So the Haitian Revolution broke with this symbolic order and with the legitimation of slavery. That I want not to say that this finished with slavery, not. But the impetus was to change the symbolic order. Okay, the second example of the liberal script and liberty in Latin America is now from my Mexican friend. Mexico, Tierra y Libertad versus Tierra de Nadie. And this was, I will explain it, a very important discussion in Mexico in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. In the French Declaration, the fundamental rights of man are freedom, property, security, and the right to resist. The concrete weighting of these human rights varies greatly. And in different liberal narratives in terms of time and space, and it's really, the variation is exactly there. And in Mexico, in the end of the 19th century, the liberal political actors, mostly urban intellectuals, journalists, politicians, looked for their role models in the US, in Great Britain, and France. They took their cue from the different speakers of liberal scripts there. They turned away from the Spanish colonial power and looked for a way to see the emerging republics from the perspective of the West. So the majority of the liberal Mexican politicians, the priorities were clear: private property, free market, foreign investment, immigration of white Europeans, and secularism. They want to transform their republic into a modern state and the colonial society and economy into a Western one. The personal freedom rights that are supposed to guarantee individual self-determination, such as right to vote, freedom of expression, or freedom of the press, that was not so important, especially for Porfirio Diaz. He was one of these caudillos del liberalismo autoritario. And so it was not in the focus of them. The focus was on private property. But with this focus, the liberal laws enabled the expansion of private property in all the country, especially for foreigners. And the enemy was the dead hands. The dead hands, that was the church with collective property, the Spanish crown, but also the indigenous communities. So there was a focus on private property, and so the liberal ideas and norms were placed outside, they themselves played them outside of the reality of a deep agrarian and largely indigenous society. There was a discourse of liberalism that had nothing to do with the living conditions and the culture of the majority of the people. 70% of the population lived in this condition. So in the second half of the 19th century, the majority of these liberal actors tried to expand their properties and didn't accept any collective rights. For example, a lot of indigenous communities have documents from the colonial time, but this was collective property and not individual property. So it was not important for them. And so the liberal ideas and norms and practices did not understand in the first, for them, the human rights, but and for the people, there was no idea of human rights, because for the people, the liberals acted in a very violent and exclusive forms. They expulsed a lot of people from the villages and from the indigenous communities in the end of the 90s and beginning of the 20s. Because for the liberals, it was so clear that tierra de nadie, there is no owner, no property for this kind of land. And so it was, if there's someone on this land, he is not the owner, he is not the property, and so he's a criminal. He has nothing to do there. He's a landless, he's a drift, he's a vagabond. And so we have a lot of criminalization of indigenous people in this moment. And the reaction is very clear. You have countless rebellions and social movements opposed the liberal practices, this kind of liberal practices, and at the end they culminate in the Mexican Revolution. And one of the famous figures, Emiliano Zapata, he contested of the tierra de nadie with the idea of tierra y libertad, land and freedom. And so for Latin America, this relation, freedom and land, is very attractive. And until nowadays, they have this, this relation, and it's very important. And In Mexico, it's ended. It's not only, and this idea of tierra y libertad is not related to individual property. It could be collective forms of property. And in the Mexican Revolution and in the Constitution in 1917, this was also, there is this kind of ideas part of the Constitution, and so the indigenous people are represented with their ideas in the Constitution. That ends with the neoliberals in 1992. Okay, conclusions. Latin America was and is involved not only in the material foundation of promise of progress in Europe, but also in the broadening of the ensemble of liberal scripts in a variety of ways. The interaction between Latin America and Europe will still play a central role today, as can be seen both in the liberal promise of progress and in the core concept of freedom. The expansion and rewriting of the concept of freedom against colonial blockades and blind spots, such as slavery, as well as the inscribing of the linking of freedom not only to private property but also to other kinds of property. These are new ideas, other ideas, and are pronounced by other groups, by other peoples, enslaved people and indigenous people, until nowadays. And they brought their ideas into the liberal narratives. In their revolutionary practices, they used the abstract declaration of human rights to concretize them and to intervene in the expansion of a liberal narrative of the narratives in Latin America, and with effects for Europe. However, the complex process of interaction in Latin America as in Europe also lead to threats to individual and collective self-determination. I will mention two. They arise not only from right-wing and left-wing authoritism, but also they arise of something like a radicalization of liberal values themselves. You can see it now in Argentina with Milei. There is something like a degeneration of liberalism, of liberal ideas. You can observe it. And this is really one of the risks of liberalism in the world, this kind of degeneration. It is becoming clear that it's not a matter of linear writing and new writing, but we can have also the narrowing of liberal ideas and of narrowing of the range of variation. And I think we are now in a moment of narrowing the range of variation. You can see it also here with the different rights of the different groups in the world. Challenges the liberal scripts arise in the global and local context, and the promise of progress. For some, that's the second risk. Then the promise of progress for some, normally Europeans, North Americans, some Chinese, for some, means limiting the rights of self-determination of others. It's not only that we are using the resources of Latin America, that's with all the problems, ecological problems. It's a second problem behind this. And this is that our progress, European progress, is limiting the self-determination of a lot of actors in Latin America. I will explain it. There's a lot of territories now with the ILO Convention of 169. There is some protection for them, but in these territories, we can find a criticism that is and voices that make clear that there is an interrelation between the process of the one and the damage of the others, but the limitation of these voices is a limitation of the liberal rights of these persons. So the interaction is, we progress here and limitation of liberty for the others. So we have a contradiction between progress and liberty on the global level. The inclusion of their voices, of these indigenous voices, sorry, I will come to this. Das habe ich heute gar nicht gezeigt. Doch, aber das ist jetzt das Letzte. The inclusion of these voices is very important for the understanding of the global interdependencies and interaction, but it's also very important for the future of liberal values and norms and practices. So you can ask, and area studies have to ask this, what have the Guatemalan indigenous movement against mining in Guatemala, what have this to do with the liberal script? Nothing. Huh? No, it had a lot to do. Because these people have a limitation in their human rights, in their liberty to express and to publish and to move, to participate in movement. They have a limitation in their rights because they are affecting the progress, the base of progress of others. So I think here the area studies, and with this I will finish, the area studies have a big contestation to ask the right questions, to bring together the problems, the movements, the critiques of these voices in these territories in Latin America, to bring together this with the liberal ideas of freedom and self-determination. So I thank you very much, and I think we have not to repeat the same problem we had between Hegel and Haiti. Perhaps we can make it better, and to bring these different parts together. Thank you so much for your attention.